Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for tuning in, for taking the time to our little webinar on the implementation of CER Directive in Germany, the so-called KRITIS Umbrella Act, or KRITIS Dachgesetz in German. Thank you for being here. I'll be brief with introductions, a couple of housekeeping remarks, and then we'll kick it off right away. Thanks for being here, for listening, and obviously I'll put this right at the front. You'll be receiving the slides and a link to the recording of the webinar. We're recording this. You will not be in the recording. You're muted. You cannot speak. You can put questions in the Q&A box here on Zoom. Please do so if you have any questions. Either we can pick them up right away at the end of the webinar, or we'll get back to you afterwards. Depends on how specific it is, and let's see how time goes. We're aiming for roughly 25 minutes, maybe half an hour, and there'll be time afterwards. We will cut off the recording before the questions. Maybe telling you who we are. We're Celin and Thorsten from Fischer's European Technology and Data Practice. We're both in Germany in our team, and we deal with everything in data regulation and also cybersecurity. So this fits right at the heart of what we're doing any day, all the weeks throughout the year. Thanks again for being here. I think that's it, me telling you a couple of organizational remarks. I'll hand it over to the important person today. Celin, please take it away. The floor's yours.
Thank you, Thorsten, for the introduction. It's great to see that so many of you have tuned in today to hear about the implementation of the Critical Entity Resilience Directive, the CER Directive in Germany. So what will we be talking about today? We will take a look at what the CER Directive regulates and how Germany implemented the directive and how the CER Directive fits into the wider picture of the various security and cybersecurity legislation that entities need to consider in the EU. Following this brief introduction into the CER Directive, we will look at the specific obligations that organizations face under the CER Implementing Act in Germany, the KRITIS Umbrella Act in Germany, the KRITIS Dachgesetz. To sum up the webinar, we will provide an overview of the actions that affected entities should consider now for Germany, and in the end, we will have sufficient time to answer any questions that you may have at this point. So before we take a closer look at the contents of the CER Directive, here is a brief overview of the implementation process of the CER in Germany. So while the initial CER Directive was adopted already at the end of 2022, it took the German legislator quite some time to publish a first draft of the CER Implementing Act in December of 2024. While some EU member states complied with the CER implementation deadline on the 17th October 2024, Germany was not one of these member states. Due to the dissolution of the German government at the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025, the legislative process came to a standstill, and as a result, Germany published a new draft of the KRITIS Umbrella Act under the new government in September 2025, and finally adopted the Umbrella Act in March 2026. So how does the CER Directive integrate into the existing legislative framework in the EU, but also in Germany? At an EU level, CER is the resilience counterpart to the NIS2 directive. CER focuses on resilience of critical entities across an all-hazards spectrum, while NIS2 is the cybersecurity pillar. On the slide, you can see where the CER directive lands in Germany's existing compliance landscape, and it doesn't start from zero. So Germany is essentially building the CER implementation on top of the established BSI ecosystem, and I will tell you a little bit more about those existing regulations. On the left of the slide, you can see obligations that in Germany are already quite familiar from the BSIG, the NIS2 Implementing Act in Germany, especially when we talk about registration and incident reporting mechanisms. On the right-hand side, you can see the British KRITIS regulation, the BSI KRITIS Verordnung, which is not a new instrument in Germany. It predates the CER Directive by several years and has long formed part of Germany's national critical infrastructure framework, and is also relevant now when we take a look at the CER Directive. The BSI KRITIS regulation was introduced in early 2016 on the basis of the BSI Act, the BSIG, where most of the NIS2 regulations have now been implemented. It operationalizes the concept of critical infrastructures by defining sectors. So for instance, energy, water, food, telecommunications, finance, health. And it also sets the threshold values to determine which operators qualify as critical entities. In Germany, the KRITIS logic is heavily threshold driven. So you assess whether specific services entities cross defined thresholds. It provides the self-assessment threshold mechanism for companies to determine whether they fall into the critical KRITIS regime and thereby into the BSI-driven compliance obligations. So while the BSI KRITIS regulation itself already exists, it is likely that it will be adapted in the context of the new legislative framework, in particular the KRITIS Umbrella Act. The CER Directive covers now more sectors than the current BSI KRITIS regulation in Germany. So Germany may expand or align sector definitions, including additional sectors like public administration, space, and wastewater. But the BSI KRITIS regulation will also have to adapt its quantitative thresholds. So for instance, the number of users of a critical facility or a capacity. Under the CER Directive and the KRITIS Umbrella Act in Germany, there is a shift towards a risk-based identification that can lead to adjustments of these thresholds, and also a parallel system where some entities may be in scope even if they do not meet the traditional KRITIS thresholds. So the regulatory landscape is moving toward a more dual or layered regime. We have the BSI KRITIS regulation and the NIS2 Implementing Act, which lay down cybersecurity obligations. In addition, we have now the KRITIS Umbrella Act, the CER implementation, which addresses physical and operational resilience. So what does the CER Directive actually regulate? The EU is reacting to a risk environment where multiple disruptions can happen at the same time. So for instance, extreme weather events, cyber incidents, and other shocks occurring in parallel. The core idea of the CER Directive is resilience of essential services. So not just preventing incidents, but also ensuring that critical services continue and can recover quickly after a disruption. So the focus is both preventative, reducing the likelihood and impact of disruption, and also follow-up care, so how organizations respond, recover, and restore services. So what is new about the CER Directive? The CER broadens the focus by moving from a narrow set of areas to many sectors at an EU level, so resilience isn't handled as a niche topic anymore. The all hazards concept of the CER means that the CER is not limited to one specific risk type, so for instance, cyber incidents, but it deliberately covers natural, man-made, accidental, or intentional disruption scenarios. That is also why CER is typically discussed alongside NIS2 regulations. NIS2 targets cybersecurity specifically, while the CER addresses what sits beyond purely cyber topics, so meaning overall resilience of these critical entities. In addition, the goal is to harmonize critical entities regulation in the EU. The directive is intended to reduce fragmentation by setting a common EU baseline, so there's more consistency across member states and sectors. The CER explicitly asks regulators and organizations to consider interdependencies because in a highly connected economy, disruptions can cascade from one service or sector into others. So the takeaway here is that the CER is a service continuity and resilience directive built for compound crisis and cascade effects. As briefly mentioned, the CER and the German KRITIS Umbrella Act follow an all hazards disruption approach. So we're not looking at one threat type in isolation, but at natural, man-made, accidental, and intentional disruptions. The key message here is that critical entities have to build resilience across the full spectrum of disruption scenarios. So these can include natural disasters, cyber attacks, systemic supply chain failures, geopolitical challenges, and importantly, cascading effects across interconnected sectors. So the lens shifts from did an incident happen to can the essential service continue or be restored quickly, even when multiple things go wrong at once. This is what the term resilience stands for in this context. From a practical standpoint, organizations are expected to do 4 things. They need to identify vulnerabilities, assess dependencies, implement preventative measures, and develop continuity plans that cover both accidental and intentional scenarios. So the planning includes operational recovery and not just compliance documentation. The examples on the right of the slide illustrate how this plays out in reality. When you take large-scale IT service outages, even if you're not an IT company, you may rely on IT service continuity to deliver your critical service. If you have a disruption in water supply due to a power outage, this is a classic cascade. a failure in one sector can materially impact other sectors as well. And if you have a terrorist attack on a power infrastructure, an intentional physical disruption scenario, that can show why Brazilians must address bricks and mortar events and not only cyber events. With that risk landscape in mind, the next step is who is in scope and what concrete obligations follow once an organization is treated as a critical entity and operator under the German framework. So how does an organization become a critical entity under the CER Directive? The key point is that the obligation sits with the member states. As the CER Directive is a directive, it needs to be implemented into member state law. Each member state must thereby identify critical entities by the 17th of July this year. Importantly, the identification is not arbitrary. The directive requires that the classification is based on 2 building blocks at a national level. So member states must make a risk assessment and they must provide a resilience strategy. Article 6 of the CER Directive essentially applies a 3-part test, and I will walk you through it in order to show what you can also follow on the slide. First, the entity must provide one or more essential services. So we start with service criticality and not just by being a big company. In addition, the entity must operate in the member state and the critical infrastructure must be located on that member state's territory. So there is a clear territorial connection for supervision and enforcement. At last, the incident would have significant disruptive effects either on the entity's own essential services or on other essential services that depend on it. This is where the directive focuses on interdependency and cascading effects that show up directly in the identification logic. So the CER Directive sets the EU framework, but the concrete identification mechanisms and thresholds, as mentioned earlier, are implemented on a national level, and Germany's approach has some distinctive features in how operators are captured and how scoping works in practice. Before we go into these details, I also want to take a look on the German supervisory authorities in terms of the CER implementation. So the German supervisory setup is that entities will typically deal with under the CER Directive, the KRITIS Umbrella Act landscape is that there is a policy coordination layer, an operational registration and reporting layer, and a sector-specific regulator. At the top of the first layer sits the Federal Ministry of the Interior, the BMI. So the BMI sets the political direction and coordinates cross-sector work streams, including national strategies, and it's also the ministry interface towards EU-level coordination. In practice, this means that the BMI provides the overarching framework and coordination, while the day-to-day supervision is operationalized through competent authorities that I will introduce now. The most important entities here are the BSI, the Federal Office for Information Security, and the BBK, the Federal Office for Civil Protection and Disaster Assistance. The BSI is the key operational authority in the existing German IT security framework, and it's also the competent regulator for the German NIS2 framework. And the operational model is a joint reporting registration setup involving both the BSI and the BBK, which is why they are both mentioned on the slide as they are both working together. So conceptually, the BSI and the BBK are practically the front door for registration and structured reporting flows, plus ongoing monitoring and support functions. In addition, we have, for some sectors, we have sector-specific competent authorities. So you can see some examples on the slide here. We have the BNetzA, the Federal Network Agency. This is the competent authority, for instance, for telecommunications sector. And we also have the BaFin, the Federal Financial Supervisory Authority, for instance, for financial institutions. So even where the BSI and the BBK may be the central operational touch points for registration, for instance, sector regulators can still play a role alongside for supervision and enforcement within their specific sectors. So now that we have a bit of an overview of the CER Directive, its aim and scope, as well as the supervision in Germany, we will take a closer look at what the German Umbrella Act regulates and who's regulated by it. To address the first scoping question under the German implementation, we will take a look at who can be affected in principle. Under Section 4, Paragraph 1 of the KRITIS Umbrella Act, the law targets operators of entities that provide critical services, meaning services where a failure can create supply bottlenecks or risks to the economy, public safety, health, or the environment. The key point here is that this is sector-based scoping. So if you operate in one of these regulated sectors that you can see on the slide, and your entity is significant for a critical service, you may fall into scope. The sectors that you see displayed on the slide here in white have already been regulated by KRITIS regulations in the past, and the red displayed sectors on the slide are newly in scope with the introduction of the CER Directive. There are two things that are worth clarifying in this regard. Being in a sector alone is not automatically enough for you to fall within the scope of the CER Directive. In practice, the law relies on further concretization, so meaning which services are critical, and when an entity is critical depends on categories and thresholds that are typically detailed by secondary rules and ordinances in member state law, similarly to how you have it under the NIS2, where you're not only falling under NIS2 when you're engaging in a specific sector, but also if you provide specific services. So for companies, the practical workflow is usually that you need to confirm that you're operating in a regulated sector, and then you need to check whether your service or your entity meets the criticality criteria and thresholds used for identification that are laid down in member state law. So now that we've covered the which sectors question, the next step would be to determine whether a specific entity is actually critical. So the identification logic and the thresholds and what happens once an operator is in scope. So let's take a look at how Germany determines whether a specific entity counts as a critical entity under the Umbrella Act. The law itself makes clear that the Federal Ministry of the Interior will set the categories of entities and the relevant threshold values by statutory regulation. And that regulation can also define cutoff dates for when thresholds start or stop applying, and it can define certain categories that are deemed critical regardless of thresholds. The Umbrella Act therefore only gives the architecture and these regulations that the BMI will enclose, gives the practical list and numbers that you need to consider in addition. So I already talked about the BSI KRITIS regulation in the beginning when I introduced the thresholds. As this regulation does not fully cover the new sectors, so for instance space, and additional key points need to be considered under the CER Directive, this regulation will be amended to comply with the CER Directive, but it already provides some guidance as to the relevant thresholds for some sectors as of now. So when the BMI determines these thresholds, it will also need to take into account the national risk analysis and risk assessments. And this is specifically risk-based, not just a purely numeric test. So on top of that, the law lists concrete criteria that are considering when setting these thresholds. And these criteria include, for instance, supplied residence, so the number of people using the critical service, dependencies, how strongly other sectors, industries depend on that critical service. The impact plays a role, so the duration and extent of potential effects of failures, disruptions on important economic activity, societal functions, public security order, public health, or also natural resources. The market position, so the operator's market share in the market for critical services. The geographical extent, the geographical area potentially affected, including also cross-border impacts. And the importance, so the operator's importance for maintaining the service, including whether there are alternatives for providing that service. In addition to these criteria, the law also provides a baseline. So the regular threshold value is generally 500,000 residents supplied by one entity in order to be covered by CER Directive. So to summarize this very extensive scoping assessment, what entities need to consider is whether they are in a regulated sector, whether they fall into one of the entity categories, and whether they pass the threshold test, and then sanity check against the criteria that I just listed. So dependency, impact, geography, substitutability factors that the law uses to shape those threshold numbers. So once an entity has considered it is critical, a number of obligations apply, and we'll take a closer look at these now. So once an entity is considered a critical entity, the registration obligation under Section 8 of the KRITIS Umbrella Act becomes relevant. And the core rule is here quite simple. So operators must register within 3 months after the entity is considered critical, but not earlier than the 17th of July 2026. Registration is done via a joint registration mechanism set up by the BSI and the BBK under the BSI Act, and the information is submitted to the authorities through that shared interface. So what do entities have to provide in this registration process? The list of the data that have to be provided is quite similar to the NIS2 regulation. So It's the operator's name and legal form, including commercial registry number where applicable, its address and contact details, the sector, and where applicable, the branch and the critical service for which the entity is significant have to be described, the entity category and supply metrics, in addition to location, supply area, and public IP ranges. It has to inform about whether it also provides its services in other EU member states, and it has to provide a contact point where the BSI can reach, or to whom the BSI can reach out to when it has questions on critical entity matters. So it's quite similar to the registration that needs to be done under NIS2 regulation. However, and we've received these questions quite a lot of times when we first talked about the NIS2 registration a couple months ago or weeks ago, entities cannot bundle NIS2 registrations and KRITIS registrations, and they need to perform two separate registrations. In addition, a Germany-specific feature worth highlighting is that self-registration approach. So the operator has an active duty to self-assess whether it is in scope of the KRITIS Umbrella Act in Germany and register. And the authorities in Germany will not determine whether an entity is within the scope of KRITIS or not. So once registration is done, the next steps are that the operator obligation will follow in sequence. So this will be risk analysis, resilience measures, and plans of reporting, and we will look at these closer now. Section 12 of the KRITIS Umbrella Act addresses the operator's own risk analysis and risk assessment obligations. So once an entity is or has assessed that it is in scope, the operator must have a structured, documented view of the risks that could disrupt the provision of its critical service. Timing-wise, the risk analysis is not just performed on a one-time basis, but Section 12 of the Umbrella Act requires operators to conduct the risk analysis as needed, but at least every 4 years. So what must the analysis be based on? The operator's analysis must be built on the national risk analysis and risk assessment that will be disclosed by the national regulator, and it can also rely on other trustworthy information sources that will be disclosed. So the law explicitly forces a dependency lens. So operators must assess risks to the availability of their critical services that arise from their dependence on critical services provided by other critical operators, including dependency across sectors and even in neighboring EU member states and third countries. And it also works the other way around. So the operator must also consider the extent to which other sectors depend on its own critical services, again, including cross-border dependencies. This risk analysis becomes then the foundation for the next KRITIS Umbrella Act steps because it drives what resilience measures and planning are reasonable and proportionate and necessary to take for the operator. Section 13 is very important because it addresses the resilience measures and the plan that operators need to implement. So it requires operators to implement resilience measures and document them in a resilience plan. It is structured around 4 main objectives, and these are preventing incidents, ensuring appropriate physical protection, responding and defending and limiting negative impacts, and restoring the critical service quickly. So prevention means that operators must implement measures aimed at avoiding incidents in the first place. So the regulation explicitly references emergency planning as an example category of measures supporting prevention. When we talk about physical protection, the law gives examples like structural, technical securing, and organizational site protection, perimeter measures, surveillance instruments, detection devices, and access controls. Incident response measures are quite commonly known, so it's about risk and crisis management procedures and predefined alarm workflows, meaning having playbooks and escalation paths ready when something happens. Restoring focuses on operational continuity and recovery. So the law mentions measures to keep operations running, including backup power and also identifying alternative supply chains to resume the critical service. Emergency management is the broader umbrella around response and recovery. It is covered by the explicit reference to risk and crisis management procedures and protocols and defines steps in the alarm case. At last, we have awareness. Section 13 explicitly requires that personnel are made familiar with the measures through information materials, training, and exercises. 2 guardrails matter for this implementation process. So the first, the measures must be proportionate and based on the national risk analysis and the operator's own risk analysis, and they should follow the state of the art with an explicit balancing of effort versus risks. In addition, operators should set out the measures in a resilience plan. They should apply it and show that the reasoning behind the chosen measures, so that once they have to provide this resilience plans, or in case they have to provide this resilience plan to the authorities, they don't only list the measures that they have taken, but they have arguments for why these measures have been chosen. So once the resilience plan is in place, the next question is how incidents are handled externally, and so meaning incident reporting requirements and timelines. So once an incident occurs or allegedly potentially occurs, operators must notify very quickly, as we have very short timeline reporting regimes. Notifications are sent to the BBK, but importantly, they are sent via the joint reporting point set up by the BSI and BBK. So at first, or as a first step, an incident must be reported without undue delay, and at the latest within 24 hours after becoming aware, which is quite the short deadline. And as a second step, if the incident is ongoing, this initial report has to be updated once new information is available. As a last notification deadline, we have 1 month, so no later than 1 month after becoming aware. The operator must also submit a very detailed report of the incident containing all information that is available. So what information are we talking about that must be included in these reports? So the report should contain the information available at the time of the notification deadline that allows authorities to understand type, cost, and possible impacts, including cross-border impacts. So the Act, for instance, mentions data points such as number and share of affected persons, actual and expected duration of the incident, and geographical area affected, including whether the area is geographically isolated. What is very important to mention here is that the reporting or the incident reporting does not replace other reporting duties that an entity may have under sector-specific legislation or under NIS2 legislation. So notifying of an incident under the KRITIS Umbrella Act may still lead to the same or parallel obligation to report an incident under NIS2 if the definitions are complied with. So let's take a closer look at how an incident is defined under the KRITIS Umbrella Act, as it is very important to be clear on what is an incident under the KRITIS Umbrella Act, for instance, in comparison to what is an incident under the NIS2 regulations that we know. So under Section 2, Number 9, KRITIS Umbrella Act, an incident is an event that significantly impairs or could significantly impair the provision of a critical service. However, the definition contains an important carve-out, so events that are exclusively security incidents in the sense of the BSI Act, so the NIS2 Implementing Act, or the Telecommunications Act, these do not count as a KRITIS Umbrella Act incident. So if something is only an IT or telecommunication security incident and there's no significant impact or risk of an impact on the critical service, this will typically be a BSIG, so NIS2 or a telecommunications issue, but it will not be an incident under the KRITIS Umbrella Act. So in addition to this registration and risk analysis, as well as notification obligations, we have obligations related to the implementation and monitoring under the KRITIS Umbrella Act. Under Section 20 of the KRITIS Umbrella Act, management is not just informed, so management is legally obliged to ensure implementation of the resilience measures that we have just talked about. So the management bodies of operators of critical entities must implement the resilience measures that the operator must take under Section 13, and they must ensure implementation through appropriate organizational measures. So resilience under Section 13 becomes a board management responsibility and is not a purely operational security team task. If management violates this duty, they can be held liable to the organization for culpably caused damage under the company law rules applicable to the entity's legal form in Germany. And there's an important qualifier. So under the KRITIS Umbrella Act, this liability only applies if the applicable company law rules do not already contain a corresponding liability rule. So the statute is designed to fill a gap rather than reinvent corporate liability altogether. And in Germany, we do already have quite extensive corporate liability rules for most entity forms. So practically, this is why operators should treat KRITIS resilience like a governance topic. The organization needs clear internal ownership, reporting lines, and documented oversight so that management can demonstrate that it has ensured implementation of the KRITIS Umbrella Act. At last, it's of course super important to look at supervision and enforcement of the resilience obligations that are contained in Section 13. This sits with the competent authority that we've discussed in the beginning of this webinar, and Section 16 of the KRITIS Umbrella Act gives these authorities quite the toolbox to verify compliance with the KRITIS Umbrella Act. So a practical point here is the interaction with cyber evidence. The competent authority can, via the BBK, ask the BSI, the competent regulator for NIS2, to share parts of evidence already submitted under the BSI Act, so the NIS2 Implementing Act, that are needed to check compliance with the KRITIS Umbrella Act. If this isn't sufficient and there's not sufficient information that was already submitted under NIS2 regulation, the competent authority can in addition request information and suitable evidence, and it can explicitly require to see the resilience plan that I have just described. If this isn't sufficient, verification of compliance can also be done through audits. So operators may have to submit audit results, including identified deficiencies and the underlying documentation. In extreme cases, authorities can also carry out on-site checks, so including through a qualified independent third party with access to relevant premises, information systems, and installations during business hours. If deficiencies are found through one of these enforcement measures, the authority can require a remediation plan and order remedial measures within a reasonable period. So the takeaway here is that compliance is actively verifiable at operator level via Section 16 of the KRITIS Umbrella Act. So when we are talking about compliance, we should also take a quick look at what fines under the KRITIS Umbrella Act can look like. These are contained in Section 24, and it sets a tiered administrative fines depending on what obligation is breached, ranging from 100,000 euros to 1 million euros. So let's start with the baseline. The baseline fine level is up to 100,000 euros for the so-called other cases. So these are in particular where operators fail to submit registration information correctly or fully or on time under Section 8, and can also cover non-cooperation during verification. So for example, refusing access or not providing records or information when the authority verifies compliance. This would also fall into this baseline tier. The next tier is up to 200,000 euros, where an operator breaches an enforceable order related to resilience verification, meaning orders under Section 16 to provide further evidence, the resilience plan or documentation, or to implement remediation measures, as we've just discussed on the slide before. The third tier is up to 500,000 euros. It's tied to audit results. So if the operator fails to submit an audit result or submits it incorrectly, incompletely, or late, this is also addressed in Section 24 with a maximum fine of 500,000 euros. And at last, we have the top tier shown here. It's up to 1 million euros. It applies where an operator breaches an enforceable order connected to the registration enforcement mechanism, which is the highest fine. So the law penalizes both non-compliance and also non-cooperation, including wrong late registration data, missing audit results, and ignoring remediation orders that are exactly the behaviors that Section 24 fines. So we've talked a lot about what the directive contains, and it was a lot of information in the short period of time. So therefore, let's summarize what entities should consider now if they want to find out whether they are in scope of the KRITIS Umbrella Act, and if they are in scope, what are the next steps? So to wrap it up, the key takeaway is that the KRITIS Umbrella Act creates a clear sequence. So first, entities should determine whether they are in scope, and once they have considered that they are in scope, they need to register and they need to build risk resilience capability and criticality and ensure they can meet the fast incident reporting clock. So the first step is the scoping assessment. So operators need to confirm whether you operate in a covered sector and whether the entities meet the criticality criteria and thresholds, including the 500,000 regular threshold benchmark and the qualitative criteria of dependencies, impact, geography, and importance used to shape the thresholds. Governance should be set up early if you've considered that you're in scope. So identify owners internally, like legal compliance, security and operations, and appoint a regional contact point because this is part of the registration data set. Then, of course, the risk assessment workstream should be built. So under Section 12, the operator risk analysis must be grounded in national risk analysis and explicitly consider cross-sector and cross-border dependencies. And it must be refreshed at least every 4 years. Of course, the risk outcomes need to be translated into your resilience measures and your resilience plan. So Section 13 is structured around prevention, physical protection, response, impact limitation, and rapid restoration, plus staff security and awareness through trainings and exercises. And the measures must be proportionate and state-of-the-art. Finally, of course, incident monitoring and reporting needs to be operationalized so that entities can act within the statutory timelines. Incidents must be notified without undue delay and within 24 hours of becoming aware, updated ongoing and followed up by a detailed report within 1 month. And you must also check whether the same event triggers parallel reporting obligations, for instance, under NIS2, because other legal reporting obligations remain unaffected. So this was our brief introduction into the implementation of the CER Directive and its implementation in Germany. And I would hand it over to Thorsten if we have any questions.
Thanks a lot, Celin. And thanks a lot to all the attendees for tuning in and stayed tuned in. We're here for a couple more minutes. We'll stop the recording momentarily.